the steady-state velocity distribution of a granular gas. This is work done with Prasad, who will be presenting a poster on some related stuff. Dibyendu, who's not here, and Sanjeev, who's in the audience. And also, this work started from discussions in the last status meeting, so I thought it's appropriate to speak here. Okay. So what is the problem? You take a set of inelastic particles, like steel balls in a container. You keep shaking them for a long time, and then you ask, if I measure the velocity distribution, so it looks something like that. P of V as a function of V. You look at the tail here and ask, is this tail universal? Is the distribution universal? If the answer is yes, then the question is, what's the distribution? This is an old problem in granular material. If it is elastic gases, you get Maxwell distribution, Maxwell-Boltzmann, and if it's granular, what's the distribution? So let me try to summarize what people know. So there are many experiments. I'll summarize some of them. So some of the experiments show that if you do, so these are experiments on shaken balls. These are experiments on shaken charged particles, shaken through electric field. And if you look at the tail here, so these various plots are for different densities, different driving parameters, and so on. All of them fall into the same curve when scaled by the VRMS. And the solid line that is plotted here is e to the power a v to the power 3 by 2. And that seems to match the data completely. Similarly here, in this data, with 3 by 2, the entire data is described, and a Gaussian is plotted on the side to show that it is not Gaussian. So these two experiments show that the answer seems to be universal, but non-Maxwellian, and this beta exponent which describes the stressed exponential is 3 by 2. But there are other experiments. So these are similar shaken balls. So in this particular one, this is a Gaussian. This line is the beta equal to 3 by 2. And on this line, you find something that's even far slower than the e to the power 3 by 2, e to the power 3 by 2. And these different data are for different parameters, like density of the system and so on. Similarly, for another experiment on shaken balls, as density is varied, it goes from a Gaussian to an exponential. So it seems to depend strongly on the driving parameters. So these experiments would suggest that it is non-universal and non-Maxwellian, and you can get a range of exponent beta, which characterizes this exponential. So what about modeling? So to model inelastic particles, what you do is you take hard spheres, and they undergo two kinds of dynamics. One is they collide. When they collide, they conserve momentum, but the energy is dissipated using where the coefficient of restitution is less than 1. Then you have to drive. The typical driving that is done is you take a particle and add a small noise to the velocity. So V goes to V plus some eta. Eta is drawn usually from a Gaussian white noise. Then there are two kinds of models people consider. One is the hard sphere model, in which two particles collide at a rate proportional to the relative velocity. And there's a simpler model in which this rate is set to 0. The rate is set to a constant, which is called the Maxwell model. So Maxwell model is a simplified model in which you can do calculations, more calculations than the other model. Okay. So with this model, there are a lot of numerical studies. I picked out 2 of them. So in one of them, they have done simulations with various coefficients of restitution. These are plots where the coefficient of restitution and the density is varied. And you look at the tail of the distribution. So in this one, it goes from Gaussian, and this is the stressed exponential, and the tail seems to be a Gaussian. On the other hand, there are some other simulations which show a Gaussian and then cross over to beta equal to 3 by 2. So there's confusion in the numerics too. So it could be, so some of them show Gaussian, some of them show non-Gaussian and universal. What about theoretical approaches? there are two main approaches. One is the Boltzmann equation for inelastic gases. Here, using some calculation, by writing the Boltzmann equation modified for inelastic collisions, you can show that P of V, I forgot to put a reference here. P of V goes as e to the power minus V to the power 3 by 2. This is work due to Ernst et al. On the other hand, you can do similar calculations for the simpler models like Maxwell model, where you get an exponential. So in the theoretical approaches, you always find a universal behavior, and this 3 by 2 matches with the experimental risk. So if I were to summarize what is known, the experiments, simulations, it doesn't seem to tell you what exactly the tails are. And that's not surprising because, to get a tail, it's like taking two logarithms, and by that time, there's not enough data to fit a good power to that. So now, but if driving is done this way, where you add a random noise to your velocity, and since collisions conserve momentum, so if I look at the center of mass momentum, velocity, it does a random walk, which implies your total energy diverges as t. Therefore, all these models which people study don't have a steady state. Therefore, whatever calculations are not done for a system that is stationary. So to overcome this particular problem, it was suggested by Prasad and Sanjeev and Abhishek that you assume that the particles, when they collide to the wall is a particle with much larger than much more heavier than the particle. And then you can derive that whenever a particle collides, it has a dissipative component here and then a noise added here. If you modify the driving rule from here to here, then a steady state is reached. But then the question is, what is the steady state velocity distribution for such a driving? So that is the question I'd like to answer. Okay. So if you do the right driving, this may not, there are more ways of driving, but one particular way of driving where a steady state is reached, what can you say about the tails of the distribution? Okay. So noise you draw from some distribution. So if you imagine driving using a wall, then it's not a Gaussian. It's always something that's bounded. There's V max you can impart. So we will consider various kinds of noises. Okay. So we considered Maxwell gases in which the rate of collision is independent of their relative velocity. The advantage is that you can write a set of equations which are exact, and then you can try to solve these equations numerically exactly. So we consider the one component gas, and what we find is P of V is highly non-universal, and we can show that the tail of the distribution is fixed entirely by the tail of the noise you put in. And this is not surprising, because if you were to drive some set of particles, whenever two particles collide, the velocities go down. So if I were to look at the tail is populated by particles which are driven recently, and that driving, therefore, those particles have been dominated by the tail of the distribution. That is the argument. And because of this, it is valid for, even if you take three-component Maxwell gas and you drive all the three components, you'll get the same answer, that the answer is non-universal and fixed completely by the tail of theta. Now, suppose on the other hand, you take a two-component gas, that's Vx and Vy, but you drive only in one direction, in the x and not in the y. Now, what we can show, if you drive only in the x, is that the x component is fixed completely by the noise, but it seems to be universal in the y direction. So for example, in this plot, the driving is by the P of eta is drawn from a box distribution from -1 to +1. V of x has some non-universal behavior, but V of y has a nice Gaussian. So it would appear that if you drive in one direction and measure in the other direction, it is universal, and that is the way most of the experiments are done. They drive in one direction and measure in the other direction. So there is some possibility that there is a universal behavior, but in directions perpendicular to driving. So right now we are looking at we would like to look at more realistic models of hard-sphere interactions within the kinetic theory approach and drive in one direction, look in the other direction, and to see whether you can get universal. So when you, in the simulation, there are two kinds. Either you drive, they do both, and they see different kinds of behavior. When you drive from the wall, sometimes what happens is this clustering inside. So if you drive, then, and there is inhomogeneities inside. So then you get some behavior, but that's non-universal. But if you drive homogeneously within the box, then you get what I showed you is found within the box. Yes. So the data I showed is homogeneously driven from within inside. And that mimics the experiment because the experiment they drive but measure in the perpendicular direction. So it is as if you are driving in the, if I were to shake something like this. So you have to, yes, so in those experiments, for example, in 2 dimensions, if I were to shake like this and you measure in the y direction, then it seems to be sort of reasonable. Okay, there's still a depth problem, but that's what they measure. Which so sorry, they're inelastic. Yeah, but energy is, momentum is conserved. So if 2 particles collide, the momentum is conserved. So if I look at the total, we see center of mass momentum. Center of mass momentum does a random walk, and that creates a problem. So this particular way of writing puts the center of mass, there's a minus gamma v. There is a dissipation added to that.
Then question means like if it has a cutoff, like
cutoff or e to the power minus b to the power 4.
Okay. Otherwise, it's still non-universal.
Otherwise, so this is tentative. Otherwise, it would happen if I put a Cauchy, I'll get a Cauchy back.
No, but Gaussian.
No, Gaussian, is a Gaussian, but this is Gaussian is Gaussian. But if I were to drive and I take a sinusoidal driving, it's always bounded.
Okay.
So,
do you get the same distribution or?
So this is all within a calculation. So we ignore space completely.
Okay.
When you say 2 particles collide at equal rate, this avoids space completely as a mean field type model. But you can do calculations with them. In the hard sphere model, even in the kinetic theory approach, you ignore space completely. But you let the collision rate be proportional to V1 minus V2. But you can do simulation in which everything is that we have done.
That, nice. Okay.
Oh, here the number density varies from the experiments. So ideally, these theories work for dilute systems, but the experiments go from dilute to quite dense. But typically, all these results are for dilute systems, from 0.2, 0.3. So those experiments, some of the experiments will suggest that it doesn't depend on that, and some of the other experiments will suggest they depend on that.
So, sorry, here. So what about the fluctuation and the relation between fluctuation and dissipation of this kind of system?
So, there were some experiments done at one point of time where you look within a box, inside the driven box, and you identify the heat going out in a certain way by measuring particle motion going, and they showed that if you define temperature in a certain way, then you can satisfy these fluctuation theorems and so on. But I don't know whether more has happened. It's not very clear. So in that particular thing, you can extract a definition of temperature by assuming this is true. But that temperature definition doesn't match with some other temperature definition.